My husband found out I was pregnant and looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. For a few long seconds, he just stared at the positive test in my hand. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways during our 6 years of marriage. I thought he might smile, pull me into his arms, maybe even cry happy tears. Instead, his face turned cold. Then he said 5 words that shattered my entire world. "That's not my child." At first, I honestly thought he was joking. I even laughed nervously and waited for him to smile. He didn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. His eyes were filled with suspicion, anger, and something else I couldn't understand. "Derek, what are you talking about?" I asked. My voice trembled as I looked at him. He stepped back as though I had done something disgusting. "You heard me," he said. "Don't insult my intelligence." I felt the blood drain from my face. There had never been another man, not once, not even close. I had spent 6 years building a life with him. Every holiday, every anniversary, every sacrifice I made had been for our marriage. Yet somehow, in a single moment, he had already decided I was guilty. The argument exploded from there. No matter what I said, he refused to listen. Every explanation I offered was dismissed before I could even finish speaking. He accused me of lying. He accused me of cheating. He accused me of trying to trap him. I stood in our kitchen crying while the man I loved treated me like a criminal. The worst part wasn't even his accusations. It was how easily he seemed to believe them. There was no hesitation, no doubt. No attempt to understand. It was as if he had already been waiting for an excuse to turn against me. Then came the moment that changed everything. Derek pointed toward the front door and told me to leave. I stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious," I whispered. He folded his arms across his chest and looked away. "Pack what you need and go." My entire body went numb. I kept waiting for him to calm down. I kept believing that if I gave him enough time, he would realize how insane this was. But he never did. Within an hour, I was standing outside with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. The February air was freezing. I sat in my car in the driveway, staring at the house that had been my home for 6 years. The lights were still on inside. Derek was probably sitting in the living room watching television while I tried to figure out where I would sleep that night. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. I wasn't just losing my husband. I was losing the future I thought we were building together. For several minutes, I couldn't even start the engine. I just sat there crying until my phone screen blurred through my tears. Finally, I called the only person I trusted completely, my best friend Jessica. When she answered, she immediately knew something was wrong. I couldn't even finish explaining before she interrupted me. "Where are you?" she asked. I told her. "Come here," she said without hesitation. "Right now." Those 2 words saved me. An hour later, I was sitting in Jessica's apartment surrounded by boxes of tissues and half-finished cups of tea. She listened as I told her everything, every accusation, every cruel word, every moment of disbelief. By the time I finished, she looked angrier than I was. "Something doesn't make sense," she said quietly. At the time, I thought she was simply defending me. I had no idea how important those words would become later. The next few days passed in a blur. Derek ignored every call, every text message, every attempt I made to talk. The man who had once promised to love me for the rest of his life acted as though I no longer existed. Then his lawyer contacted me, not Derek, not his family, a lawyer. The message was short and cold. All future communication regarding the marriage would go through legal channels. Reading those words felt like being punched in the stomach. A week earlier, we had been discussing baby names. Now I was receiving legal notices. The speed of it all was terrifying. It was almost as if Derek had prepared for this long before I ever told him about the pregnancy. That thought stayed in my mind. At first I ignored it. I told myself I was overthinking, but strange details kept surfacing. The way he had reacted so quickly, the way he already seemed emotionally detached, the way his mother Linda suddenly stopped answering my calls as well. Linda and I had never been especially close, but we had always been polite. Now she had disappeared completely. It felt coordinated, planned, deliberate. Every day my instincts screamed that something bigger was happening behind the scenes. 2 weeks after being thrown out, I received a phone call that changed the direction of everything. The caller introduced himself as Gordon Reeves, an estate attorney from Portland. At first, I assumed he had the wrong number. I had never heard his name before, but then he mentioned another name, Thomas Caldwell. The moment I heard it, my heart stopped. Thomas was my first husband. Years earlier, our marriage had ended respectfully. We had remained friendly before eventually drifting apart. I knew he had passed away several months ago, but I hadn't spoken to anyone connected to him since then. Gordon explained that Thomas had named me as a beneficiary in his estate. I sat frozen in Jessica's kitchen while the attorney carefully explained what that meant. The numbers he mentioned sounded unreal, life-changing, impossible. I genuinely thought there had been some mistake. After the call ended, I spent nearly an hour staring at the wall. Nothing made sense anymore. Why would Thomas leave me such a significant inheritance? Why had nobody contacted me sooner? And most importantly, why did I suddenly feel like this information was connected to everything Derek had done? A terrible possibility slowly began forming in my mind. What if my husband already knew? What if the pregnancy wasn't the reason he threw me out at all? What if something far bigger had been happening behind my back? I didn't have proof yet, only questions. But for the first time since the night Derek kicked me out, I stopped feeling helpless. Because if my instincts were right, then my marriage hadn't collapsed because of betrayal. It had collapsed because someone was hiding a secret. And I was about to find out exactly what that secret was. The phone call from the estate attorney should have been the biggest shock of my life, but strangely, it wasn't. What truly unsettled me was the timing. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I replayed the night Derek threw me out, something felt wrong. His reaction had been too immediate, too confident, too rehearsed. Most husbands who receive unexpected news ask questions, they argue, they demand explanations. Derek had done none of those things. He had gone straight to accusations and then straight to divorce. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like he had already made that decision before I ever told him I was pregnant. Jessica noticed the change in me almost immediately. One evening, she came home from work and found me sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by notes, legal papers, and a notebook filled with dates. She set down her purse and looked at me carefully. "You're building a timeline," she said. I nodded. "Something isn't right." She sat across from me and spent nearly 2 hours helping me reconstruct everything that had happened over the previous year. At first it seemed pointless, but then patterns began appearing. Small details I had ignored suddenly looked important. Derek had started acting strangely months earlier. He became secretive with his phone. He began taking private calls outside. He spent more time with his mother than usual. Most importantly, his attitude toward money changed completely. Looking back, I realized there had been warning signs everywhere. 6 months earlier, he had started asking unusual questions about my first marriage. At the time, I thought he was simply curious. He wanted to know whether Thomas had family. Whether he owned property, whether he had investments, I answered casually because I had no reason to suspect anything. Thomas and I had divorced years before. His finances had nothing to do with my current life. Yet now those conversations suddenly seemed significant. Why would Derek care so much about a man who had been out of my life for years? A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Gordon Reeves, the estate attorney, called again. This time he explained more about Thomas's estate and the process ahead. During the conversation, he casually mentioned something that made my stomach tighten. Several months earlier, someone had contacted members of Thomas's family, asking questions about the estate. The caller claimed to be a journalist researching wealthy entrepreneurs. At first, nobody thought much of it. But after comparing notes, they realized the questions were unusually specific. The caller wanted details about beneficiaries, trust arrangements, and inheritance distributions. Gordon mentioned it only because the family later became suspicious. The moment I hung up, I felt a chill run through my body. I knew exactly what I was thinking, and I hated myself for thinking it. Could Derek somehow be involved? It sounded crazy, paranoid even, yet the timing was impossible to ignore. Someone had been investigating Thomas's estate before I ever learned I was a beneficiary. Someone had wanted information badly enough to contact family members directly. And somehow, only weeks after I discovered my pregnancy, my husband had suddenly accused me of infidelity and thrown me out. I decided to contact Thomas's sister Rachel. We hadn't spoken in years, but she agreed to meet me. When we sat down together at a quiet cafe, the conversation started awkwardly. Then I asked about the mysterious phone call. Rachel immediately remembered it. According to her, the caller had sounded professional, calm, polite. But something felt off. The questions kept returning to Thomas's assets and beneficiaries. At one point, the caller specifically asked whether Thomas had maintained contact with me after our divorce. Rachel thought it was strange at the time but forgot about it afterward. Now, hearing her describe it, my heart raced. Whoever made that call hadn't been interested in journalism. They had been interested in me. As I left the cafe, one question echoed through my mind. If Derek knew about the inheritance before I did, what exactly had he been planning? The answer arrived sooner than I expected. A week later, my attorney, Claire Morgan, obtained financial records connected to the divorce proceedings. I had hired her after realizing the situation was becoming far more complicated than a simple separation. When we met in her office, she slid a folder across the table and told me to read carefully. Inside were bank statements from our joint accounts. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed a series of transfers I didn't recognize. Thousands of dollars had been moved into accounts I had never seen before. The dates matched the months leading up to my expulsion from the house. "Did you authorize any of these?" Claire asked. No, her expression hardened. "Then we have a problem." Over the next hour, she explained that Derek appeared to be moving marital assets without my knowledge. It wasn't illegal to transfer money, but hiding it during a pending divorce was another matter entirely. The more documents we reviewed, the worse it looked. There were withdrawals, transfers, missing funds. Money had been disappearing quietly for months. Claire leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "This doesn't look like someone reacting emotionally to a surprise pregnancy," she said. "This looks like someone preparing for a divorce." Those words hit me harder than anything else, because they confirmed what I had secretly feared. Derek hadn't suddenly snapped. He hadn't acted impulsively. He had been planning something. That night, I barely slept. Every memory felt different now. Every conversation carried a new meaning. I remembered how his mother always asked questions about money, how she constantly discussed protecting family wealth, how she treated every relationship like a business transaction. For years I had dismissed it as part of her personality. Now I wasn't so sure. Then something happened that erased any remaining doubt. On a Sunday morning, Linda called me directly. I almost didn't answer. For weeks, she had ignored every attempt to contact her. Now she suddenly wanted to talk. Curiosity won. We arranged to meet at Jessica's apartment. When Linda arrived, she carried homemade cookies and wore the warm smile she reserved for public appearances. Anyone watching would have seen a concerned mother-in-law trying to repair a family conflict. But the moment she sat down, I knew this meeting had another purpose. She spent 20 minutes talking about forgiveness, about family, about second chances. She claimed Derek regretted everything. She insisted he wanted reconciliation. Then she casually shifted the conversation. "You have a future together," she said softly. "A child needs both parents." I remained silent. Linda leaned forward. "Sometimes it's better to let certain disputes go." "What disputes?" I asked. For the first time, her smile faltered. "The legal issues," she replied. "The inheritance situation, the lawsuits, all of it." There it was, the word inheritance. She had brought it up herself. At that moment, every final piece clicked into place. Derek and Linda knew. They had known for a long time. The pregnancy had never been the real problem. The inheritance was, and judging by the nervous look that flashed across Linda's face, they were becoming terrified that their plan had failed. But what I discovered next would prove that this wasn't just greed. It was a conspiracy that had been unfolding behind my back for nearly a year. And soon, I would finally uncover the evidence that could destroy everything Derek had built. After my meeting with Linda, any remaining doubt disappeared. For weeks I had been trying to convince myself that maybe everything was a misunderstanding. Maybe Derek had acted irrationally. Maybe fear had made him say things he didn't mean. But the moment his mother brought up the inheritance without me mentioning it first, I knew the truth. They hadn't thrown me out because they believed I cheated. They had thrown me out because they knew something valuable was coming, and they wanted me gone before I received it. The realization was painful, but it was also strangely freeing. For the first time since that horrible night, I stopped blaming myself. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently. The marriage I thought I had lost had already been broken long before I discovered I was pregnant. I just hadn't known it yet. The next morning, I met with Claire. As soon as I entered her office, she noticed something had changed. I told her everything about Linda's visit, every word, every expression, every attempt to convince me to walk away from the legal proceedings. Claire listened carefully and then leaned back in her chair. "They're scared," she said. "Scared of what?" "Evidence." That single word stayed with me for the rest of the day. Over the following weeks, Claire's discovery requests began producing results. Document after document arrived. Financial records, emails, account histories. At first, most of it seemed boring and technical, but Claire had spent years handling complicated divorce cases. She knew exactly where to look. One afternoon, she called me and asked me to come to her office immediately. When I arrived, several folders were spread across the conference table. "You need to see this," she said. She opened one file and pointed to a series of online searches linked to Derek's work computer. My stomach dropped. The searches were nearly a year old. Thomas Caldwell Estate, Trust Beneficiaries, Inheritance Rights After Divorce, Estate Attorney Portland. I stared at the screen. The dates were months before I had even learned about the inheritance. Months before my pregnancy, months before Derek accused me of cheating. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, search after search, research after research, evidence that Derek had been investigating Thomas's estate long before I knew anything about it. "Dear God," I whispered. Claire nodded. He knew. At that moment, something inside me finally broke, not because I was surprised anymore, because seeing proof felt different from having suspicions. For months I had been carrying uncertainty. Now I was staring directly at betrayal in black and white, but it got worse. Much worse. A second file contained phone records. Among dozens of calls was one number that immediately caught my attention. Rachel Caldwell, Thomas's sister, the same woman who had received that mysterious phone call months earlier. According to the records, Linda had spoken with her for 17 minutes. 17 minutes. The call happened 4 months before Derek threw me out. I looked up at Claire. She was the caller. Looks that way. For a few seconds I couldn't speak. Everything suddenly made sense. The fake journalist. The questions about the estate, the interest in beneficiaries, the sudden panic when the inheritance became real. Derek and Linda hadn't stumbled across information accidentally. They had actively searched for it. They had investigated it. They had tracked it. And when they realized I stood to inherit a significant amount of money, they started planning. The next discovery was the one that truly destroyed them. An email, just one email. Short, simple. Devastating, it had been sent from Derek's personal account to a business associate. Most people would have overlooked it. Claire didn't. The message contained only a few lines, but one sentence stood out immediately. "We need to resolve this situation before the Portland attorneys contact MM." The email was dated several days before Derek threw me out, several days. Not hours, not after the pregnancy announcement, before, meaning he already knew, meaning he had already started planning, meaning the entire accusation had been a lie. I sat there staring at the printed page while anger surged through me. The pregnancy wasn't the cause. It was the excuse. The cheating accusation wasn't genuine. It was a weapon. He needed a reason to get rid of me before the inheritance reached me. And he thought he had found one. For the first time, I understood the full scale of what had happened. Derek hadn't destroyed our marriage in a moment of panic. He had sacrificed it intentionally, not because he stopped loving me, not because he believed I betrayed him, because money mattered more. A few weeks later, the official deposition was scheduled. It would be the first time I had seen Derek since the night he threw me out. The morning of the deposition, I felt surprisingly calm. Months earlier, the thought of facing him would have terrified me. Now it didn't, because fear survives on uncertainty. And uncertainty was gone. I knew exactly who he was. The conference room was quiet when I arrived. Claire sat beside me. Across the table sat Derek and his attorney. For a moment, our eyes met. He looked older, more tired, more nervous, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something important. He wasn't confident anymore. He was worried. The deposition started with routine questions. For nearly an hour, Derek answered carefully. Whenever questions became uncomfortable, he claimed he couldn't remember. Whenever details became dangerous, he avoided them. His attorney objected repeatedly. It was obvious they were trying to minimize damage. Then Claire placed the email on the table. The room changed instantly. I watched Derek's expression freeze, just for a second, but it was enough. "Do you recognize this email?" Claire asked. "Appears to be from my account. Did you write it?" A long pause. "I may have." The hesitation was all anyone needed. Question after question followed, each one tightening the pressure, each one exposing another piece of the truth. The confident man who had thrown me out months earlier slowly disappeared. In his place sat someone who knew his lies were collapsing. At one point, he looked directly at me. I expected to feel rage. I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt nothing, absolutely nothing. Because the man sitting across from me was no longer my husband. The husband I loved existed only in memories. This person was a stranger who had chosen greed over loyalty, a stranger who had thrown away 6 years of marriage for money he never truly possessed. And deep down, I think he finally realized he was going to lose everything. By the time the deposition ended, even his attorney looked defeated. As we walked out of the building, Claire smiled for the first time all day. "He'll settle," she said. "You think so? I know so." I looked back at the building behind us. For months, Derek and Linda had controlled the story. They controlled the accusations, they controlled the narrative. But now the facts were speaking, and facts were far more powerful than lies. What neither of them realized was that the worst part was still coming, because very soon the court would force Derek to pay for every decision he had made. And when that happened, the life he fought so hard to protect would begin falling apart piece by piece. The deposition changed everything. For months, Derek had been controlling the situation. He had thrown accusations at me, painted himself as the victim, and acted as though I was the one hiding secrets. But once the evidence started appearing, the story he had carefully constructed began falling apart piece by piece. The searches on his work computer, the phone records connecting Linda to Rachel, the hidden financial transfers, and most importantly, the email proving he knew about Thomas's estate before he threw me out. None of it looked good. More importantly, none of it could be explained away. For the first time since this nightmare began, the truth was stronger than the lies. As Claire predicted, Derek didn't want this case reaching a courtroom. He understood what would happen if a judge saw everything. The discovery process had exposed too much. Every new document made him look worse. Every new piece of evidence strengthened my position. 11 days after the deposition, his attorney contacted Claire about settlement negotiations. The settlement discussions lasted nearly a week. While the lawyers handled the details, I focused on something much more important, my pregnancy. For months, I had been surviving one crisis after another. Between the divorce, the legal battle, and the inheritance situation, I had barely allowed myself to enjoy becoming a mother. Jessica constantly reminded me of that. She forced me to attend doctor's appointments. She helped me prepare a nursery. She even refused to let me spend entire days reading legal documents. Whenever I started obsessing over the case, she would point at my stomach and remind me that someone else needed my attention more than Derek ever deserved. Looking back, she probably saved me more times than I realized. Then the settlement finally arrived. I sat in Claire's office holding the papers while she explained the terms. Derek surrendered all claims to Thomas's inheritance permanently. He was required to return every dollar he had taken from our joint accounts. The court also awarded me a significantly larger share of our marital assets because of his deliberate financial misconduct. The house, investment accounts, and several other assets were transferred to me, but there was one page in particular that I kept reading over and over: the prenatal DNA results. Derek had demanded proof that the baby was his. Now he had it. The results confirmed exactly what I had always known. He was the biological father. There had never been another man. There had never been an affair. There had never been any reason to accuse me of cheating. The entire foundation of his accusation had been a lie. I wondered if he stared at that page for a long time before signing the settlement. I hoped he did. A few weeks later, the first distribution from Thomas's estate arrived. I was sitting in Jessica's kitchen when the notification appeared on my phone. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. The number didn't feel real. Not because of the money itself, but because of everything it represented. Thomas had changed my future without even knowing it. His final act of kindness had protected me at the exact moment I needed protection most. I called Rachel that afternoon and told her the case was finally over. She was quiet for a moment before saying something I'll never forget. "Thomas would be happy knowing you're safe." I sat there with tears in my eyes because I knew she was right. A month later, Derek signed the final divorce papers. The marriage officially ended without drama. Without another fight, without another accusation. He barely looked at me during the final meeting. The confidence that once defined him had disappeared completely. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel revenge. Mostly, I felt relief. The chapter was finally over. I could stop surviving and start living again. Then, on a warm Tuesday morning in July, my daughter arrived. The moment they placed her in my arms, everything else disappeared. The court case, the betrayal, the lies, the inheritance, none of it mattered. All I could see was her tiny face staring back at me. She had dark eyes and a surprisingly stubborn expression that made the nurses laugh. I named her Ellie. Holding her for the first time felt like stepping into a completely different life, one that wasn't defined by loss or betrayal, one that belonged entirely to us. The following months brought more changes than I ever thought possible. I bought a beautiful home with a large backyard and enough space for Ellie to grow up surrounded by peace instead of conflict. I expanded my consulting business and slowly rebuilt the professional life I had put on hold. Jessica remained part of our daily lives, becoming the Aunt Ellie never officially had. Rachel visited several times and brought old photographs of Thomas from years before I knew him. Looking through those pictures gave me a strange sense of closure. I was grateful for the role he played in my story, even though neither of us could have imagined how important it would become. As for Derek, life moved forward. The settlement forced him to liquidate significant assets, and his business struggled afterward. He maintained visitation rights with Ellie, and to his credit, he generally respected the arrangements established by the court. I learned something important during that period. No matter what he did to me, he was still Ellie's father. Separating those two truths wasn't always easy, but I did my best. My anger belonged to the past. My responsibility belonged to the future. I never spoke to Linda again. After everything that happened, there was nothing left to say. The last time I saw her was during the final stages of the settlement process. She looked older, smaller somehow. Not because of age, but because the certainty she once carried had vanished. The woman who thought she could manipulate every situation had finally encountered consequences she couldn't control. Sometimes, usually early in the morning while Ellie sleeps upstairs, I sit on my back porch and think about how close I came to losing everything. There was a moment on that freezing February night when I sat alone in my car believing my life had ended. I remember staring at the house behind me and feeling completely broken. If someone had told me then what the next year would bring, I never would have believed them. The inheritance. The investigation, the legal battle, my daughter, the new home, the new beginning, none of it seemed possible. But life has a strange way of revealing people's true character when circumstances become difficult. Derek counted on my fear, Linda counted on my isolation. Both of them believed I would quietly accept whatever happened to me. What they never expected was that I would fight back. They never expected evidence. They never expected the truth to surface. Most of all, they never expected me to discover my own strength. If this entire experience taught me anything, it's this. The people who try hardest to diminish you are usually counting on one thing: that you don't know your own value. The moment you realize your worth, their power disappears. Mine certainly did. And every time I watch Ellie laughing in our backyard, I am reminded of something even more important. Sometimes the worst day of your life is only the beginning of a much better story.